The Prime Minister under fire over reports his office pressured the former Justice Minister to abandon the government's prosecution of Montreal engineering firm SNC-Lavalin on fraud and corruption charges. A new report shows childcare costs in most Canadian cities are climbing, but federal funding may ease the strain on families. We'll look at the numbers and debate whether government-subsidized daycare is the best way to go. The federal government's controversial environmental assessment legislation is under the microscope in the Senate. Is a consensus building that it must be changed? And will the government accept those changes? And our weekly panel of commentators is here to discuss allegations of PMO interference and the NDP's policy on Venezuela and more. We'll begin with allegations of political interference in the justice system at the highest level of the federal government. A report today in the Globe and Mail alleges officials in the Prime Minister's office tried to pressure the former Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, to abandon a Justice Department prosecution against Montreal engineering and construction firm SNC-Lavalin. CPAC has not been able to independently verify the allegations made in the Globe report. SNC-Lavalin is facing fraud and corruption charges for allegedly paying millions in bribes to win government contracts in Libya between 2001 and 2011. According to the Globe report, SNC was trying to avoid a criminal proceeding in return for paying a fine. Wilson-Raybould was recently shuffled out of the Justice portfolio and into Veterans Affairs. Here's how the Prime Minister responded today to the report alleging political interference from his office.
The allegations in the Globe story this morning are false. Neither the current nor the previous Attorney General was ever directed by me or by anyone in my office to take a decision in this matter.
Not necessarily direct, Prime Minister. Was there any sort of influence whatsoever?
As I've said, at no time did we direct the Attorney General, current or previous, to take any decision whatsoever in this matter.
You heard the Prime Minister repeat the word direct and directed, and that will play an important part in the story as our coverage continues tonight. This issue dominated the daily question period in the House of Commons, even though the Prime Minister wasn't there.
We've heard the Prime Minister's very carefully scripted, legalistic answer. But the question is, did anyone in the Prime Minister's office at any time communicate with anyone in the former Attorney General's office on the matter of the criminal prosecution of SNC-Lavalin, yes or no?
Justice.
Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister has said earlier today, these allegations are false.
He can't answer a simple yes or no question. So I'll ask him a slightly different question. According to the lobbyist registrar, SNC-Lavalin lobbied this government dozens of times. In those meetings with senior officials, did the subject of their criminal prosecution ever come up? Yes or no?
Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't privy to those conversations. As the Prime Minister has said earlier today, these allegations are false.
Well, this is the big political story of the day. Let's get into it with three members of Parliament. Marco Mendicino is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure. He's a former Parlsec to the Minister of Justice. Chris Warkentin is the Deputy House Leader for the Official Opposition. And Nathan Cullen is the Democratic Institutions Critic for the NDP. Good to see you all, gentlemen.
Good to see you.
Mr. Mendicino, let me start with you. You're a lawyer, former prosecutor, I think. If there's been political interference in trying to tell the Justice Minister what she should do, or that she should tell justice officials what to do in a potential prosecution of a private company in this country, is that a big deal?
Well, let's start with the simple fact that there hasn't been any direction or influence.
If there is that a big, is that a big deal?
But let me ask you, Peter, what's the point in entertaining a hypothetical that has no basis in
fact? Well, I want to know, we want viewers to know how serious a situation would be for politicians or the people who work for them to interfere with public servants trying to prosecute a case.
I'm simply going to reiterate what the Prime Minister said earlier today and what the Minister of Justice said today. There's been no direction or influence on the former Attorney General of Canada, Jody Wilson-Raybould. This is somebody who served with distinction in that portfolio. She has taken on a new assignment in her portfolio as Minister of Veterans Affairs. This is a portfolio that matters a lot to veterans, it matters a lot to Canada, and I know that she's thrown herself into this work. And as for the rest, obviously the opposition...
I'm sure she's very busy, but let's deal with the story we have in front of us, and that is the Prime Minister was asked today about this, and he said that nor he nor his office ever directed the Justice Minister at the time, Jody Wilson-Raybould, to do anything. But he was asked whether there was pressure on the Justice Minister at the time, and he wouldn't answer that. He wouldn't deny that. He would just say that no one directed. You're a lawyer. You use the word directed. Language is important. Is there a difference between directed versus pressured?
The distinction collapsed today, question period, and I'm confident the Prime Minister in his position has taken the approach that there has been no direction or influence on the former Attorney General of Canada as it relates to this case, and that's because he respects the office of the Attorney General.
And no pressure.
And no pressure. And that's because he respects the office of the Attorney General of Canada. He respects the independence of the judiciary. And that doesn't just relate to this matter. It relates to the way in which we have supported the justice system in a variety of ways. Okay, Mr. Workington, your leader called for full disclosure today. What does that mean? What do you want?
We do want full transparency. Obviously, there's some very serious allegations that have come to light through the Globe and Mail's report today. There have been no answers from the government. We had the Prime Minister repeating what looked to be a carefully scripted line. He was asked several questions. He continued to go back to that very scripted line time and time again. We had the new Justice Minister in the House of Commons today repeating lines again and again and again, refusing to answer very simple yes or no questions. It is starting to look like a cover-up, and we need transparency in this issue.
Mr. Cullen, what do you want?
Well, much the same, and I think that's what Canadians are also looking for. Peter, you'll remember back to the letter, which was a bit of an unusual thing when Jody Wilson-Raybould was taken out of justice. It seems like against her wishes, where she wrote to Canadians and said, "It's a pillar of our democracy that our system of justice be free from even the perception of political interference and uphold the highest levels of public confidence." Now, in the absence of any specific thing, we all wondered, and she also talked about the need to speak truth to power. Now line it up with this SNC-Lavalin case, a company that illegally donated more than $100,000 to the Liberals, and that was caught in court, who has been found in corruption and bribery scandals not overseas, but also here in Montreal, and who met with the Liberal government more than 50 times, 17 times of which they wanted to talk about justice and law issues. They're a construction company wanting to talk to this government about law. So your specific question about the Prime Minister consistently just said one word, very specific word, wouldn't go beyond that. And the fact is, we asked Jody Wilson-Raybould questions today in the House of Commons. And instead of allowing Ms. Wilson-Raybould to answer, the new Justice Minister got up and said, "I have never been influenced," etc. It's like, look, there's a lot of smoke here, and where there's this much smoke, there's often fire, and we need to get to the bottom of this.
Now, given parliamentary rules, it's not unusual for a minister who's changed portfolios to not answer questions about her time in that old portfolio. But Mr. Mendicino, let me ask you this. This whole story would be settled, wouldn't it, if the former Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, would just, outside the House, call reporters together and say there's nothing to the allegations, the Globe story is untrue, there was never any pressure. Why isn't she doing that?
Minister Wilson-Raybould has spoken repeatedly about the pride that she took in her work as the Minister of Justice. I can't tell you the number of times that she stood up in the House, stood up in public, in the context of her work, and has spoken with great pride. Not only about
Mr. Mendicino, look, the government has this hanging over them. The thing could go away if Jody Wilson-Raybould came out and said, it never happened. There was no pressure. She's still in cabinet. She's still a part of your team. Where is she?
Well, there's also some convention around respecting the advice that is given from the government's lawyer to the rest of cabinet. But I just want to come back to the statements that she has made repeatedly.
This is not about advice. It's that I got no pressure.
What I would say is that Minister Wilson-Raybould spoke with great pride, not only about the work that she did as an individual, but as part of a team within the Government of Canada. She did so as the Justice Minister, and she has done so, I would underline, continue to do so as the Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Workington, so how do you push this story forward? If you want answers, how do you get them?
Well, we're hoping that this government will start to open up and be transparent. They promised that when they were first elected. Of course, Jody Wilson-Raybould, in her exit letter from after she was fired as the Attorney General, she talked about the pillars of democracy being the assurance that the political wing didn't influence the judiciary. She spoke about speaking truth to power and seemed to be indicating that that was the reason that she was pushed out. Now, today we have these revelations from the Globe and Mail. Obviously, there is a source that's talking to the reporters at the Globe and Mail. We expect that there will be some more information. But this government promised transparency when they were elected. They talked about bringing in the sunlight and letting it be the disinfectant. Today we had absolute stonewalling. We had no answers to the questions that were asked. We had repetition of very carefully crafted, legally vetted lines. There has been no transparency on this. The government has an obligation to be transparent. If they will not do their job and be transparent, we're going to continue to press for an inquiry in this issue.
All right, Mr. Cullen, the government amended the criminal code last year as part of an omnibus budget bill to allow the government to negotiate a deferred prosecution or remediation agreement. These kinds of things have been in place for some time in the U.S. and in Great Britain. They set aside the criminal prosecution, or they allow the government to do that, involving companies in return for paying a fine so that the actions of a few in a company maybe don't preclude the whole company from doing business, for instance, with the government. At the time, some media suggested, look, that could benefit SNC-Lavalin, which has this legal fight on criminal charges in front of the federal government. Is that legislative change, as far as you're concerned, connected to these allegations of political interference today?
I really have a hard time believing anyone couldn't connect the dots for this reason as well, that Liberal members on the Justice Committee, on the Finance Committee, because this thing never went to Justice, it went to Finance, said this is inappropriate for a finance group to be hearing about this. This has got to kick. This is a major change. And what it does is it allows a company, even one that went through a fraud case and was convicted of bribery, fraud, and a whole bunch of really serious things, by doing this remediation program, they can still bid on government contracts. Right. Who bids on a lot of government contracts? SNC-Lavalin. So if at the same time the Prime Minister's office or someone in his office was leaning on the Justice Minister to go easy on SNC-Lavalin or plea out the case, as they were moving through page 531 of their massive omnibus bill, a major change to our justice system, to allow criminal behavior to not be properly punished and ban them from government contracts. This is such a huge problem for a company that is so clearly enamored with the Liberal Party that they sloshed them more than $100,000 in illegal donations. This smells like a scandal. I don't know why the Liberals don't understand that.
I want you to have time to answer that. Is there a connection here? If you look at SNC-Lavalin and its legal fight with the government, and you look at a change to the criminal code, and you look at the story in the Globe and Mail today, tell me why there's nothing to see there.
Well, the trouble with Nathan's argument is that it is just filled with a lot of supposition. And it also misses the main point that remediation agreements have been debated quite extensively, both in the House of Commons as well as the Senate, under the sunlight of witnesses and testimony and evidence, many of whom nonpartisan experts who have said this is an important tool. I think Nathan also assumes that there is not a case in which a remediation agreement wouldn't only stand to benefit the justice system and the Canadian public, but certainly any victims who may be entitled to some compensation, some remediation. Peter, I've worked in the criminal justice system, and I can tell you that there are cases where prosecutors were properly exercised their discretion to spare the courts the resources and instead focus on remediation, focus on making the victims whole, while at the same time working with corporations to elevate the way in which they govern themselves.
But you'd agree the optics here of changes that allow remediation to occur, and then sometime later,
I'm saying
news media stories that say pressure was put on the Minister of Justice to go for the remediation option. There's an optics issue.
I'm saying that makes for a good political hit, and I'm saying that that's exactly what the opposition are trying to do here, without in any way actually talking about both the merits of this new legislative tool under the Criminal Code, as well as the transparency within which it was debated and put forward by members of the House of Commons.
Mr. Warkentin, I got about 15 seconds, 30 seconds. Let me hear you on that if I can.
If or not it's the law, or if it's a good law or not, the question is we have an Attorney General who the allegations now say that she did not believe that it should go through the remediation. The allegation is the Prime Minister's office was leaning on her heavily to pressure her to allow this prosecution to go away. When she wouldn't, she was then fired. That is the scandal. Our friends from the Liberal would have us believe that it has something to do with something else, but I'll tell you, there's a smoking gun here, and it looks as though the allegations that were printed in the Globe and Mail are true.
We're out of time, gentlemen. Thank you all for your participation tonight and talk about this story. We'll talk again soon. Take care.
Thanks,
Peter.
A new report out today gives us some insight on just how much Canadian families are paying for childcare costs. In a nutshell, it says most Canadian cities have seen child care rates increase above the rate of inflation, and yet some cities are seeing rates ease because of government subsidies. In a moment, more on the child care rates, and we'll also debate policy on government child care subsidies. But first, a little background. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives study found that childcare costs have risen faster than the rate of inflation in more than 60% of Canadian cities since 2017. Childcare for infants was the most expensive. The three cities at the top of the category were Toronto at an average of $1,685 per month, Mississauga and Hamilton, and Kitchener at $1,490 a month, and Vancouver at $1,400 a month. By comparison, Quebec cities were amongst the lowest, clocking in at an average of $175 a month, followed by Winnipeg at $651 and Charlottetown at $738. The number of provinces with policies on childcare affordability has doubled in the past year, with British Columbia, Alberta, and Newfoundland and Labrador joining Quebec, PEI, and Manitoba in setting childcare fees for preschoolers. The survey saw a 13% drop in fees in St. John's and a 6% drop in fees in Edmonton. British Columbia has also introduced childcare measures that were being implemented at the time of the survey. Well, as we say, the daycare report was prepared by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. David McDonald is a senior economist with the organization. He joins me now. Mr. McDonald, good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in to talk about these numbers. Let me start first of all by getting a little bit of background here. How did you obtain this information? What did you survey?
We made 10,000 phone calls over the course of the summer. We called most of the childcare centers or home daycare providers in the country. All licensed and regulated providers would be included here in some of the bigger cities we sampled, but it was a very long 4-month phone survey.
Is there an easy answer to this question? Why are the childcare fees so uneven across the country?
Well, it really depends on provincial policy. This is everything to do with provincial policy and very little to do with market pressures and that sort of thing. So Quebec's got the cheapest fees because the Quebec government has decided that they're going to cap fees at $8 a day for most parents. And places like Toronto have the highest fees because there's no caps on fees, and therefore it's what the market will bear, and so you end up with very high prices.
All right, so is this really a story about government intervention in the childcare system? Where that happens, the fees tend to be moderated somewhat.
Absolutely, and so if you rank, in each one of the age categories, you rank the cities by lowest to highest fees. The lowest fees are always found in the Quebec cities. Second lowest are in Winnipeg. Third lowest are in Charlottetown, because Manitoba and Prince Edward Island also have set fees, although at a higher level. And then the rest of them are market system, and so they're always higher.
And so in that context, then, when the survey shows that in 61% of Canadian cities, the childcare costs are rising higher than the rate of inflation, is that the same connection as well? That in a free market setting, they'll go higher than they will, obviously, in a government regulated.
Yeah, they are increasing in Quebec. So Quebec has an inflationary increase, which this year was actually a little bit higher than inflation. And in other provinces, like in Charlottetown and Prince Edward Island, or Winnipeg and Manitoba, those fees have actually been fairly constant over the last couple of years because the government has decided not to change them, and so they just stay the same year after year.
Okay. The report also points out some provinces have taken steps to lower childcare costs. What are they doing?
Yeah, so this is all very new. So we've got these three provinces, Quebec, PEI, Manitoba, these have traditionally been the set fee provinces, and the rest were market rate. Well, this year, in a real big change, we see Newfoundland, Labrador, St. John's in particular, has almost half of its spaces now at their set fee of $30 a day. And as a result, the fees fell 13% in that city as a direct result of this move to set fees. And we're also seeing Alberta and British Columbia embarking on a portion of their systems being either set fee or a fee reduction. So $25 a day, we're finding in 10% of the centres in Alberta, in Calgary and Edmonton. And in British Columbia, they have a small section at $10 a day, but most of the providers are actually signing up for $100 or more reduction in their fees for preschoolers. And so it's another way by which the provinces are trying to reduce fees. So we have a lot of experimentation, in this year in particular, at the provincial level.
Okay, and it sounds like perhaps more to come. What role is the federal government and federal funding playing in the cost of childcare in this country?
So the federal government has become involved for the first time in a decade and a half in childcare, starting with bilateral agreements that it was signing last summer. And that's the first time they've been involved since the Martin years in 2005. And so for the efforts in those three provinces, those new provinces, Newfoundland, Alberta, and BC, the efforts pre-existed the federal money, but I think it's safe to say that the federal money encouraged them to roll out more quickly or to more places. And so the federal government is involved through these bilateral agreements, and the provinces are using that money in different ways, three of which towards reducing fees.
And as I understand it, the federal government is it's planning to spend $7.5 billion on childcare spaces across the country in the next decade. So what effect will some of that money is rolling out, and what effect do you think we'll see on costs and fees as more of that money rolls out? And I guess more of these provinces take a closer look at their childcare systems and how to moderate the costs.
Yeah, so I certainly think that by the survey we're going to do this summer, that'll start in a couple months, we'll see fees drop again in St. John's. We missed a lot of the fee decreases in British Columbia due to the timing of the survey and when it was being rolled out. So we expect fairly big decreases in fees in British Columbia as a result of this $100 a month reduction in fees. And we may see some additional reduction, particularly in Calgary, as more $25 a day centres are constructed there. And so I think that we will continue to see fee decreases in those three provinces. And what will be interesting, what the wild cards are, is what happens in the federal election. Will there be more money towards childcare? And also what happens in Ontario with their provincial budget upcoming.
Okay, let's finish on this. The provinces receiving federal childcare money, they're not compelled to lower fees, although in some cases that's happening. But is that something that should be looked at? Should they be compelled to lower fees in relation to the money they're getting from the federal government?
Yes, they can do a variety of things. They could expand the number of subsidized spaces, for instance. They could expand the subsidies themselves for low-income households. And so that's what some of the other provinces are doing instead of targeting fees per se. Those things are important, certainly, for low-income households, but the targeting of fees are what most people experience when they try to put their kids in childcare. It's also where you get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of encouraging more people to work and driving GDP growth as a result of more, particularly female labor force participation. Right. And so, I think as we continue to move forward, I think that if the federal government wants to put more money in, I think that there's a case to be made that there should be more strings attached and should be devoted more specifically to reducing fees.
All right, David McDonald, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, we've seen the report today about rising daycare costs in most Canadian cities and how public subsidies are beginning to bring some of those rates down in a lot of cities. And in years to come, more federal money will go toward creating and maintaining more childcare spaces. But what role should government be playing in childcare? I'm joined by Andrea Mrozek, the program director for a faith-based think tank called Cardis, and by Nora Spinks, the chief executive officer of the Vanya Institute of the Family. It's good to see you all, or both of you. Thank you for coming in. When we look at the fees that many Canadian families are paying for childcare in this country, there's a wide range, but for some it can be as much or more than a monthly mortgage payment. Do we have a system that's working? Let's start there.
I would say we don't, but we also don't want to ignore parents who are at home, parents who use other forms of care, parents who use independent child care providers. So the report that came out today spoke of costs for a sector that covers care for about 20 to 25% of children. The rest of every child is being cared in a different way, and what we want is equity for the type of care that works for parents, whatever they choose.
Nora, what do you think? Is the system working?
Well, for the families that have access in their community for the type of care that works best for them, then the system is working. The question then becomes for those families who are either forced by circumstance, not being able to find the care they want, or not being able to make the choice that's best for them right now, then the system's not working. So we've got some work to do. There is no one size fits all. And the thing about childcare is that once you've got it, you're very happy with it, it's working well, it's your first choice, you're going to be pretty quiet about it. If you haven't found a good fit, then you're going to have all kinds of stressors, and that's what the voices that we tend to hear. The thing with those families who do find the right kind of care, they're in rhythm, they've got really good infant care, and then their child becomes a toddler and they have to find new care or different care.
Does the government need to be involved in childcare? Should the government, at any level, federal, provincial, in delivering childcare services?
Whatever level of involvement we see from government has to be equitable for all parents.
What does that mean?
So ultimately, I just spoke of the report where it's talking about center-based care almost exclusively. And that, again, is a low percentage of children in that type of care. And the low percentage is because parents don't choose center-based care. They're choosing other forms. So we cannot have something that funds preferentially over other types of care. We would like to see if there's going to be, and there's Canadian consensus on government funding for childcare, it has to go to anyone providing childcare. Childcare is the care of a child regardless of who does it. It doesn't happen necessarily only in centers, though it happens there too. Happens in home care centers, in home care settings, happens with family members juggling schedules, etc. We need to be equitable about that.
Nora, does it have? Is there a reason to provide it in centers, as Andrea says?
Well, it's not centers versus everything else. It's licensed, regulated, high-quality care, which is what most families want when they're in need of care in order to allow them to continue their education or participate in the labor force. And Andrew is right. There are a lot of families who aren't choosing group-based care because it's not available because there's not enough supply.
Surveys show parents don't choose it because they don't want it, not because it's not available, and that's been pretty consistent across the years.
Sorry, they choose it because they don't want it?
They don't choose center-based care first. They choose a family member first. They choose local home-based care centers first, and then they would move into something that is further away from that.
But did they do that because of the cost? Because they can get a family member to do it more cheaply?
It's remarkably resilient. This result is remarkably resilient across party lines, across whether you're working or not, and across men and women. Generally speaking, center-based care is the last form of care that people choose, and so that's not what we want to be primarily funding.
Well, the research actually shows that families want high-quality care, and high quality means licensed, available in the community, and provided by professionals. And we know that when that kind of care is available, it actually does become a family's primary choice.
You must be reading different surveys.
Well, there's perhaps some of the evidence, is contradictory on this. But I mean, let me move to the notion that we have. It seems to me we have clearly a system that is moving across the country that is headed towards a universal system and a publicly funded system. We're seeing the federal government do it. More and more provinces are starting to do more of this. Is that where we're headed?
There's a problem in childcare research, I should add, and that's that it's very difficult to get into the homes of parents, difficult to get into the home care settings. And so what you see primarily in childcare research is a study of center-based care because that's easily accessed. It's easy to know where a center is, and it's easier to look at that and study it. And so we don't tend to have a compare and contrast on the quality level with professionals versus non-professionals.
But does it say something about the desirability of that system that, let's just take the study today. The spaces are full, and people are paying, in some cases, $1,400, $1,500, $1,600 a month to do it. So
I just spoke to a care provider.
But they're going there for a reason.
And they're going there because a licensed center offers predictable, high-quality care. It allows people to plan and to manage their work responsibilities around that child care. It's dependable. If you have a private babysitter down the street and they get sick, you're stuck. If you go to a child care center and one of the staff is sick and not available, they'll have a substitute that will come in. So there's a lot more predictability. There's a lot more trust that is able to build because of that. And it's not just the parent and the childcare provider, but it's also the employer. And so the employer knows that the employee has got backup available and is less likely to have to call in because the babysitter is not available, as opposed to somebody who's using a licensed center-based care.
I just spoke to a care provider in Sudbury, and the center at the top of the hill has spaces available where she is full up. Other care providers in the GTA do things like provide care for not just the child late and perhaps overnight, but also for the mother when the weather was bad. This is a kind of care you'll never see in center-based care, which is why I think it's less popular. And the idea that people are flocking to centers is promoted by reports like this that do not compare and contrast with the other forms of care available that parents are using.
So you suggest there's a better form of care, and your organization also suggests that the government should fund parents rather than care providers.
It's the most equitable way to get at support for parents with young children.
So how would that work? So how does that work if I need care? So fund the parents. So give me what amount of money?
Well, and that would be where the discussion would lie. But certainly when you have thousands of dollars going only to one form of care in the center-based setting, that's not fair to the many, many parents across the country who don't choose to use that form of care and will never see that money.
But it's very similar to looking at the publicly funded education system. We offer publicly funded education in most provinces from junior kindergarten on up. What some parents can still choose private care, or private education. They can pay for that, or they can homeschool if they want to. But we provide a base, we provide a foundation, because we have a collected best interest in making sure that kids have optimal development. And we chose age 5 historically because that was the age at which, at the time, we allowed kids to walk to school by themselves. But what we now know, and what the research shows around child development and healthy brain development, is that really 5 is arbitrary. And so what we're now seeing is that the provinces who are dropping that down and investing heavily in the early years, they're seeing results not only in family health and well-being, women's involvement in the paid labor force, less family stress because of the security and reliability of the care. So we have a vested interest as a society to invest in the education of children. That's not being at all debated. We've been investing in education for a long time. It's just where we start that is at debate right now.
Quick final word to you, Andrea, on that.
Developmentally, 5 is not arbitrary. It's a stage at which children can hold on to themselves and be out in the world. And here I'm quoting Canadian developmental psychologist Dr. Gordon Neufeld. Kids younger than that, parents know why they want a home-based setting because it's like the home environment. We want to support parents in their choices.
Okay, thank you both for the conversation. Good to talk to you both.
Thank you.
Senators on a committee studying the government's environmental assessment legislation say they will be proposing significant changes to the legislation. Earlier this week, the committee voted to hold cross-country hearings on Bill C-69 to hear from Canadians. And over the past 2 days, senators have been hearing testimony from government officials and regulators. Conservative politicians, several premiers, and some people connected with the resource industry say the proposed changes to the environmental assessment process will stifle resource development and hurt the economy. CPAC's Martin Stringer spoke with 2 senators on the committee to get their views on where the hearings are headed.
Senator Mitchell, Senator Richards, thanks for taking the time. I want to ask you, to what extent are the questions that you're raising here, because you just were talking to the regulators, to what extent do they go to the very heart of this bill?
What I'd like to say is that this process, what you're seeing today, is exactly how the Senate should work and does great work. It's very high-level questioning, very thoughtful. Everybody around that table has grappled with this bill, and so you're getting extremely good review of the bill. And yes, the questions go to the heart of the bill, as they should. The next question is, and it's probably your next question, where do we end up afterwards? Well, because of the reform It's been the practice of the Senate now to amend, and we amend extensively, and we also have a government that not only initiated the reform, but also has accepted amendments on now 25% of the bills that they've sent to the Senate. So I expect that it's very likely there'll be amendments, and the government's openness to that has been declared, in fact, in this case, by the Prime Minister himself.
Senator Richards, you had a lot of questions about, to the regulators here, the people who run the current National Energy Board, but this bill proposes a whole new set of regulators, both nuclear and in the other field. How profound, how fundamental are some of the questions about the legislation?
Well, I'm just, I'm interested if it's going to be too prohibitive to make deals with industry. I mean, that's my major concern, and it's not that I'm not concerned about other issues. I'm tremendously concerned about the environment. I'm concerned about trampling on the rights of Indigenous people. I don't think there's a senator in there that isn't concerned about these issues. But this is a broad-ranging bill, and I'm hoping that we can come to some sort of meeting of mind where we can get a few amendments, or maybe many amendments, on this bill that will allow industry to go forward with all the right safeguards for the people of Canada. That's what I'm hoping for.
One of the recommendations that's come out recently is from the Canada West Foundation. That is to cleave off everything in this bill that's to do with a new environmental assessment, put it in a separate bill because it's too contentious or potentially too obstructive. What do you make of that?
I think this bill is a very good bill. I think it's very good public policy. I mean, I've studied it for better part of a year and listened and talked to people a great deal. I think there are good ideas for accommodations and amendments, but I don't think beginning to split this bill's based on almost 3 years of consultation. It's been in the House for a year. It's been before Parliament for a year, and I think it hangs together extremely well. In fact, what we know for sure is CEA 2012 has not worked. It did not get a pipeline to Tidewater. We need to be able to deal with that. And this bill goes an awfully long way to fixing that problem. It will be better than what we've got, and it can be improved still.
Senator Richards, you said you've expressed the concerns about is this bill too restrictive in terms of what it could do to resource development. A lot of your Conservative colleagues, for example, have said they really have problems with this. Can you see major amendments being proposed by the Senate, ones that might even challenge a lot of the substance of the bill?
Well, I don't know if the major amendments would challenge the substance of the bill, but I think it might correct some of the substance of the bill. And I think there has to be time limits on consultation. You can't have so many cogs in a wheel that the wheel breaks down. And I'm just worried an overreach of environmental concerns and an overreach in consultation. I think with amendments, those can be taken care of, and I hope they can be.
Last question. Do you think the debate will become the powers of the Senate, and do you have the powers to make recommendations that could actually challenge a bill?
Well, the Senate has only defeated 6 bills since 1945. It's not something. This bill comes out of a campaign platform that the government was elected on. So it would be very, very, I don't want to second guess the Senate, but it would be very, very unlikely that the Senate would or should defeat this bill. But amendments will be passed, I'm sure, and the government's open to them, and they will make an assessment of whether or not they change the bill in a way that they can't live with.
Okay, I want to thank both of you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
The federal government today announced new funding to improve human rights for LGBTQ2I people in developing countries. $30 million over the next 5 years and $10 million every year after that. The announcement was made by the Minister of International Development.
The first portion of this funding goes to establishing a new fund for Canadian LGBTQ2 organizations engaged in international development. The fund will be designed in consultation with relevant experts and practitioners. A second portion of the funding is meant to support local and regional LGBTI organizations and equality movements in developing countries. And a third portion will be used to support innovative global partnerships and multilateral initiatives that reinforce policy, advocacy, data gathering, and research efforts in this area. We also plan to create a Canadian LGBTQ2 community of practice, convened by Global Affairs Canada, to facilitate knowledge sharing and collaboration between government and LGBTQ2 experts and community members.
Danny Glenwright is the Executive Director of Action Against Hunger Canada. He joins me from Toronto to discuss the significance of the funding announcement from the government today. Mr. Glenwright, first of all, thanks for joining me today. We'll get to the announcement in a moment if I can, but first, tell me about Action Against Hunger Canada. What does your organization do and where?
Sure, thanks, Peter. Action Against Hunger is the leading international organization fighting hunger and its root causes. So we actually treat more children for malnutrition than any other organization. We work in more than 50 countries, in all the places where you can imagine, due to disease or conflict or poverty, that children and nursing mothers are suffering from malnutrition.
This funding announced today, $30 million over 5 years and then $10 million each year after that. How can that money change the lives of LGBTQ2I people who are living in sometimes terrible circumstances in these developing countries?
Sure. Well, I mean, I've spent many years traveling all around the developing world, and as a gay man, I can say that the situation for LGBTQ2 people internationally in the developing world is dire. We have referred to it as a hidden humanitarian crisis. Unlike most emergencies that are focused in one area, the problem for LGBT people is they're spread out all around the world, and they're either hiding within society or they're living life on the margins. And we know that they're more impacted by death, disease, and a destruction of their livelihoods than most other people in the general population. So this new funding announcement is a commitment from Canada. It's a really great first step and an acknowledgement that those people that are marginalized are not getting the type of humanitarian and international development support that they need. This is a humanitarian crisis, not the traditional one that we know, but it's still a crisis. And it shows that Canada is committed and is putting its money where its mouth is and is going to do something about supporting local organizations fighting to bring about equality in some of the places where these people are criminalized.
Let's talk a little bit more about how precarious is their existence in some of these countries?
Well, there's 72 countries around the world where homosexuality is still a criminal offense, and many of these punishable by death. We're talking about people who are targeted by religious institutions, by the media, by the police. They're often scapegoated by politicians who are struggling to get their political message across. They're struggling with tough economy, and guess who becomes the scapegoat? The LGBTQ2 community. And there are examples of this all over the world. We see it in the news every day. So the problem is different depending on where you go, and the extent of it is different depending on where you go. But the study that we found is there are hundreds of millions of LGBTQ people all over the world living in pretty bad circumstances. And
okay, so give me a sense of how this funding, this particular level of funding from Canada, can help to overcome some of those barriers. How will that money be used on the ground?
Yeah, well, I think it's an innovative and a collaborative approach to working and supporting with some of the local level organizations that are trying to bring about equality. Most of the organizations in many of these countries that try to advocate for the rights of these people are tiny. They are often attacked. They often have no funding. So this is Canada saying, look, we're not going to come in there guns blazing and try to change your laws and try to influence your government. We want you to do that work, but we're going to support you in that work by setting up a collaboration between Canadians working on this issue and those local level organizations and equality movements in some of these countries.
This sounds like clearly a long-term challenge. And let me pick up on something you've said here and referred to a couple of times. How open will some of these societies be to groups like yours trying to improve the lives of individuals, and you touched on it, who face discrimination from many of the fundamental institutions in these countries, including the governments, the media, and the religious organizations? They shape those societies. So how open will they be to having organizations such as yours and countries such as Canada saying, look, you need to make change, let us help you do it?
Well, let's be clear. Action Against Hunger is an organization that fights hunger, so we're not explicitly advocating for the rights of LGBTQ people. What we're trying to do is sort of incorporate an acknowledgement of their struggle into our existing programming, because we know that they're affected by some of these issues more so than the general populace. In terms of other organizations that do explicitly advocate for these issues from Canada, I think that what this does is it opens the door to greater collaboration between them and the organizations on the ground. As you say, it's tough and it depends where you go, but there are examples of successes, and one of them was noted in the in the press conference today with the minister, the story of India, which has decriminalized homosexuality this year. There's been successful gay pride, LGBTQ pride events in India since. And that was a long-fought struggle. As you noted, this is a long-term agenda. This is not going to happen overnight in some of these places, but we've got to start somewhere. And this commitment from Canada today is a huge accomplishment. We really praise it, and it's a big step forward. And I hope some of the other big international donors are paying attention.
Danny Glenwright, appreciate your time today. Thanks for giving us some perspective on today's announcement. Good to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let's bring in our panel of party commentators as we do each Thursday. Susan Smith is a Liberal commentator, Tim Powers a Conservative commentator, and Robin McLaughlin is an NDP commentator. Let's start with the big story today, a story that may be with us for some time, and that is the report in the Globe and Mail that the PMO tried to pressure the former Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, into making sure Justice Department officials did not proceed with a criminal charges against SNC-Lavalin. Susan, let me start with you. What's the big challenge for the Prime Minister on this story?
Well, I think there'll be a few. I mean, thank goodness for the lobby registry, right? So these meetings have been registered for years. It's public and transparent, so anybody, the opposition parties, the media, everybody can go back and see who's met with whom when. We all are lobbyists and we all register all of our meetings. I think the Prime Minister was clear today when he said no directive had been issued. I wasn't in the room for those meetings. I think it's going to be challenging. Canada's laws are now in line with the American laws and the British laws with regards to, what is it called, a remediation agreement?
Which allows a company facing criminal charges to pay a fine instead of having the criminal charges.
Yeah, I think pay a fine, give back any proceeds, put remediation into place. And I think the logic of it, based on what I've read in the US, UK, and other countries, is so that companies from an ongoing basis, if the personnel have changed and if things have been done to improve the situation so that there's not a global penalty on something that's happened in a particular market. I think the story is going to have some legs, sadly, and I think that's the biggest issue, is that it's not going to be a one-day story.
The big thing here, Tim, in stories like this is if you're on the Prime Minister's side, how do you unprove the story? I mean, that's the allegations are made, and he says there was no direction from my office. What do you have to do to prove that?
Well, I guess you have. Well, it's very difficult to prove who would have been.
And I
giving
suppose it's in the context of these stories. I mean, my sense is that there will be more before this story goes away, and if that happens, then the story develops, right?
It appears, based on the language the Prime Minister's used in this case, that he hasn't necessarily learned the lessons from the language he used when questions were raised from that newspaper article from many, many years ago alleging he behaved inappropriately. We talked about that before. I didn't direct. Did you suggest? There's all sorts of questions a lawyer or a reporter or any average Canadian can start asking. All right, so you're saying you did have some sort of conversation. So again, if you were the opposition, that's what you want to see.
Well, that's what they're doing today, right?
Well,
we didn't direct, but did you pressure? Direct sounds very much like
it's a very
the ultimate
legal
act, giving
term.
an order that says do this, but that doesn't necessarily preclude pressure.
Can I just add one quick point before you go to Rob? From a broader credibility perspective, this is the kind of story that particularly hurts the Liberals, but any politician, any political undertaking where the perception is created that a leader is acting for his benefit or an office is acting for his benefit or for the benefit of their friends and individuals, as some of the stories suggest, is never a good day. You're going to have to play pretty hard defense.
And are there some wider implications here, Robin, as well? This is a Prime Minister and a government that's right now in the process of trying to convince the Chinese government that there's no political interference in the justice system in this country. Now he's in a position where he's got to convince Canadians that there's no political interference in the Canadian justice system.
So the reason this has legs is because there's so many layers to this story and so many angles, and that's certainly one of them. And he's going to be judged in the court of public opinion on this, and he doesn't get the same legal rights in the court of public opinion. And what was interesting was watching question period, lines of question from the leader of the official opposition, who hasn't quite found his Tom Mulcair voice yet, but it felt a lot like Stephen Harper trying to answer questions about the check he received about Mike Duffy. Yes or no questions from the leader of the opposition, and taking all the questions at first, at least. So that's demonstrating the opposition knows that they have him here on something. The other thing is, when we all read the former Attorney General's sort of resignation note, if you will, that she posted to Facebook, there was a lot of suggestion in there itself. She said that she had always viewed her role as the Attorney General to be outside of the realm of government, that she had a duty to the laws of this country, the rule of law, etc. And now you can start to read into things there. Was that her suggesting that had to do with the SNC-Lavalin?
Here's what she said that day. It is a pillar of our democracy that our system of justice be free from even the perception of political interference and uphold the highest levels of public confidence.
And if we go back to what it is that SNC-Lavalin is accused of doing here, too, that is where, and this is not a company that's, it's seen a lot of courtrooms around the world. And I think that that's when it looks like, to Tim's point, of whose side the government's on, which is a narrative the opposition Conservatives are trying to say. He's not on your side. If they could at all suggest that he's on the side of a company facing bribery allegations in Libya, that's going to look really bad against the Prime Minister who wants to fight an election on values.
Susan, what do you think? I mean, in terms of next, you know, I still think the next thing to watch for is, are there more stories to come about, you know, what the connection is here and what may have happened. Also interesting today that we didn't, you know, there were attempts to try and get Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was in the House, to answer questions but did not. What do you think we watch for next?
Well, I think there are a few more layers to this story. I don't know that you can directly pin it on the Prime Minister, as my colleagues are trying to do. I think that the story was around officials or individuals. Nobody is registered to lobby the Prime Minister from SNC-Lavalin, from what I could see when I went back and looked. In terms of Minister Raybould commenting, it's not surprising that she didn't say anything. She's a different minister. She's a minister in a different portfolio now, and it's traditional that ministers don't comment on their previous portfolios.
Right.
So the Minister of Justice was up in the House, and he was saying that the allegations were false. No, but still, the minister...
I guess what I'm saying is, what should we read, if anything, into the fact that we don't have a statement with a full... Her office suggested today there's no comment. A full statement.
Well, we heard from the Justice Minister
denying
today.
Anything that ever happened in the Globe story is a true thing.
Yeah, but I think that the Minister of Justice this is an issue that, according to the Globe story, is a Department of Justice issue, and so the Minister of Justice spoke today.
Tim Powers, having Jody Wilson-Raybould go silent on this, does that help or hurt the story?
It hurts the government. I mean, the best way to clean this up would be for Jody Wilson-Raybould to come out and say, hey, what the Globe is saying is totally wrong. It would go away right away, because right now also Jody Wilson-Raybould in certain quarters, particularly in certain public opinion leadership quarters, is seen as not necessarily been treated fairly. She has allies and people out there who feel she got screwed over. So she's a powerful messenger right now. And if she did come forward and say that's wrong, the story dies.
Yeah, and I think if she added some detail, I mean, what you have here is the current Justice Minister being able to stand up and say, I was never received any direction, and including the previous Justice Minister. There's just so many ways that it looks like the government is trying to not answer what are really, fair questions. And the other thing here is the other layer, of course, being that if the appearance, even just the appearance that this is the reason that perhaps the first Indigenous Justice Minister was moved from her portfolio, just the appearance of that really just hurts a government that put Indigenous reconciliation top of its agenda.
I think what I would say from a communications perspective is the faster this can be cleared up, whether it's from a statement from Minister Wilson-Raybould and in breaking with convention on speaking about her previous portfolio, whether it's from a statement for her or somebody else. The faster the Band-Aid gets ripped off, the faster the story goes away.
And fair to say, I think at this point, if the intention was at some point to try and look at remediation as an option for SNC-Lavalin, that would seem to be off the table now. How could that possibly happen given this story?
Nobody's going to touch this with a 10-foot pole.
Rob, let me go back to you to start. What's the story on the NDP's position on Venezuela? Len Laverdiere was on this. The foreign affairs critic was on this show Monday saying it's time to recognize Juan Guaido. It's time to get free and fair elections, but the time for the strongman president who won't leave Maduro is over.
Yeah.
Jagmeet Singh was asked about it again yesterday in British Columbia and said it's up to the people, it's up to the people. Well, what about Guaido? Is he the guy? It's up to the people, it's up to the people. Is there confusion?
Seems to be a communications disconnect coming from the NDP leadership on this. Look, you had the best person on the show to ever answer a question about foreign affairs for the NDP. Hélène-Lavalin is a pro. She's a former diplomat. She understands the nuance and the detail of this. Now, what she will also tell you, though, is that the way that the government handled this was not the best way to assert Canada's role for promoting democracy. She's the first one to point out that our European allies gave Maduro a week to call free and fair elections, something he, of course, did not do before saying that they need to recognize someone. Both of these people are not legitimately elected leaders of the country. And the challenge is that when you're in opposition or you're a commentator, you have the freedom of saying this is what should happen. The government of Canada does have to recognize someone. So that's why eventually there does need to be a position on this. And I think Hélène-Lavalin rightly asserted that now is the time to do that, but that the government did not make any friends for us in democracy. If I could just finish, that remember that we're siding with the United States, which has 5,000 troops sitting in Colombia. So we have to be careful about how quickly we promote the American agenda of regime change. Because in the U.S., it is about regime change. In Canada, it has been about promoting democracy.
But leave aside the position the Canadian government has to take. The Foreign Affairs critic took a position for the party, and the leader of the party still didn't take the position of the party. Leaving aside what the government has to do, it's. I guess what I'm saying is the NDP got a position? Just
I don't know. It's Wednesday. Maybe they have a new one. Look, I think what happened again this week with Jagmeet Singh is an example that, or is evidence that he doesn't have a tight handle on his files. He doesn't have a tight handle on caucus. Caucus really isn't either keeping him that well informed, or he's not paying attention to what his caucus is saying. And the NDP is kind of flip-flopping in the wind. Nikki Ashton, a prominent NDP, was out, vehemently taking another position last week. Sven Robinson, a potential star candidate again for the NDP,
but that's
again
actually
the
not
opposite.
unusual
So they
for
have
the
to
NDP
walk
on this issue.
That's
the history of the NDP.
Right. But if Jagmeet
Libby
Singh
Davies
is trying
was an MP right now, she'd be probably taking the same position.
But if Jagmeet Singh is trying to present himself as leadership material, or as MP-worthy material, or as Prime Minister-worthy material, he once again isn't doing a good job.
If Jagmeet Singh had just said what Robin said a few moments ago, they mightn't have had the troubles that they have. I mean, it comes down to this. He is the leader of the party. He has to look like he's considered issues. What he said in response yesterday was pretty weak, given the intense public discussion that's happening. This came 2 weeks after he was caught flat-footed trying to address issues related to the Canadian-Chinese relationship. He doesn't look like he contemplates the big issues. That's not good for a party.
Okay, let's talk about, there's pain within that party today, and there's pain in the House of Commons, and for a lot of Canadians across the country. And Robin, I know it's difficult for you. You work for Paul Dewar, but let's take a few moments as we end the program to talk about what the country's lost here.
Well, as we head into an election that's going to involve a lot of mudslinging, we've lost someone who we all admired for being principled in his stand on whatever issue it was. If it was local, if it was fighting for Gatineau Park protections for the river, if it was fighting to protect us through the environment and from chemicals in bottled water, banning incandescent light bulbs, freeing Canadians stranded abroad, Paul Dewar took principled stands and knew that we worked best when we took our partisan armor off and worked together to build the better world that he believed in. He was a teacher. He was an advocate, a human rights fighter, a feminist, and a community leader. And today has been really nice to see people from all partisan backgrounds praise a man who, even in his last breaths, in his last year of life, tried to make the world a better place by empowering the young people unburdened by cynicism. We'll miss him.
I was thinking about Paul Dewar and my interactions with him. He was my member of Parliament, and I remember in particular 2006, the first campaign, where I spent a lot of time here doing the commentary during the election. And at the time, I had my 6-year-old in tow, who's now no longer 6. And we used to see the Paul Dewar signs, and he said to me, and this is a Harry Potter reference for those who get it, "Mommy looks like Cedric Diggory." And so for those who know Harry Potter, Cedric Diggory was the handsome kind of hero of one of the Harry Potter stories who had an untimely death and left too early. And I thought that was a very interesting, it's not a very mature observation, but it was a child's observation of the man and the integrity that they put forward. And sadly, the story closed a bit the same way. But he was a man of committed to his constituents, committed to public service, and he walked the talk. And it was in the House of Commons, and it was after the House of Commons, and even when he was sick. So the world doesn't have a lot of people like that, and so he will be missed for sure.
Good, genuine guy. I got to know him through Robin, thankfully, and got to spend a fair bit of time with Paul at different sporting events. His sons played rugby. Robin and I and you actually all played a rugby game on Parliament Hill with Paul Dewar, and you got to see Paul the dad, Paul the human being, Paul just the real decent fellow, and I liked him so much, and Robin helped on this too, I gave $100 to his leadership campaign. Apparently that didn't make a difference.
Best money you ever spent.
But Paul was that kind of guy. It didn't matter what party you were in. He was just always decent, and he put down all the partisan crap and just got on with being a good person.
Well said, all of you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Peter.
See you next week. And that's all for another edition of Primetime Politics here on CPAC, the cable public affairs channel. I'm Peter Van Dusen. Thanks again for watching.